Good evening. Welcome to this fringe about the two Davids, who, as I'm sure you are all aware, I am talking about two former leaders, David Steele and David Owen. I'm ashamed to admit, or maybe I'm proud to admit, that I'm old enough to remember when the alliance between the Liberal Party and the newly founded SDP was agreed, and we began to fight elections together on a joint platform. However, the working relationship between the two Davids between 83 and 87 became increasingly marked by tension and distrust. So what we're going to be discussing this evening is the two Davids from the perspective of people who knew them and who can give us the inside story on that. Now, first of all, our first speaker was to be Sir Graham Watson, who was a Liberal Democrat MEP from 1994 to 2014 and served as leader of the European Liberal Democrat and Reform Party group from 2002 to 4. He was also the first leader of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe group, and from 1983 to 1987, he was head of the private office of Sir David Steele, leader of the Liberal Party. Graham is currently a distinguished visiting fellow at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs. Graham is actually with us online, but unfortunately he is not going to be able to, because of technical problems, Graham is not going to be able to deliver his speech himself. So I think, Neil, you're going to do it, is that right?
That's right.
So, Neil Stockley is now going to present Sir Graham's speech for him. Neil.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. And sorry, despite strenuous efforts throughout the afternoon, we've been unable to get Graham's audio going. He's joined us from Canada as well, and so that's regrettable, but I will do my best. Okay, the two Davids, Steele versus Owen. If the Liberal SDP alliance can be described as a tragicomedy in 3 acts, the Steele-Owen period must be Act 3. And as Chekhov observed, if there is a gun on the wall in the first act, you can be sure it will be fired in the third. I salute the Liberal Democrat History Group on facilitating this review, and though it all seems an awfully long time ago, I find the memories still distress. I have no doubt the opportunity existed from 1983 to 1987 to break the mould of British politics. We blew it. As one wag observed, we failed even to scrape the mould off British politics. True, the pro-European policies of Tony Blair's government, however much recidivism the Labour Party has engaged in since, derived directly from that moment. One should be grateful for small mercies, even short-lived ones. If I take issue at all with this review of the period, it is simply related to its title. It was never, other than at the very beginning and the very end, Steele versus Owen. It was predominantly Owen versus Steele. Of course, the suboptimal working relationship between the English doctor and the Scottish son of the manse was thrown into sharp relief by the extraordinarily successful bond formed between Roy Jenkins as Home Secretary and David Steele, the backbencher, whose private member's bill to legalise abortion he facilitated. The two became better acquainted during the 1975 referendum campaign, and as fellow Celts, hit it off formidably. One can hardly imagine them arm in arm after a match at Murrayfield or Cardiff Arms Park, but in the style of the nobility to which they both aspired, they conducted a warm and fruitful relationship, nourished midweek in fine London restaurants to compensate for the rubber chicken weekend fare in the roller coaster years of 1981 to 1983. Steele's problem was that he was an outsider in British politics and a threat to the establishment. No Liberal or Lib Dem leader has had a higher personal popularity rating other than during the first week of Cleggmania. When the two Cambridge cartoonists, Fluck and Law, decided to portray Steele in their spitting image cartoons as David Owen's puppet, they did more damage to the cause of reform than anything the other parties could achieve. Liberal Party activists rose to the bait, and some of the difficulty in the alliance arose from their uncharacteristic tendency at that time to pugnacity. That was never David Steele's style. Steele grasped one basic truth. At a time of great division, the public wanted to see politicians working together for the good of the country, not fighting each other. He was prepared to endure anything, even his spitting image, in pursuit of that. From Steele's perspective, everything started to go wrong at what was faintly ridiculously termed the Ettrick Bridge Summit. It became clear to all and sundry as the 1983 election approached that the popularity of the younger man far outstripped that of the senior partner, and that the description Prime Minister designate applied to Jenkins was a drag on the electoral chances of the alliance. At first, neither of the principals wished to recognise this. Changing horses in midstream is in any case fraught with difficulty, and being dragged behind them through the water had little to add to the public esteem for either. The decision to highlight a private meeting at Steele's home to deal with the delicate issue only added to the embarrassment. The outcome for the alliance was that Steele was perceived to have pulled his punches, but Jenkins was nonetheless wounded. Combined with Roy's ill health, this merely hastened Owen's ascent to the leadership of the SDP, and it was never glad, confident morning again. The two Davids were anything but natural partners. Indeed, it was a marriage forged in hell. I recall early one occasion when Debbie and David Owen were invited to Sunday lunch at Steele's flat in Pimlico's Dolphin Square. Not only did the suave metropolitan visitors from Limehouse look as if they had hailed from a different planet, but the Burgundy and whiskey in the host's drinks cabinet gave no quarter to the visitors' preference for champagne or light beer. And in London on a Sunday in 1983, such tastes could not be satisfied from any retail outlet in the vicinity. Their leadership styles could not have been more different. Steele, the laid-back, reasonable, self-assured delegator; Owen, the frenetic, hands-on micromanager. Arguably, these characteristics in both were exaggerated. Steele sought always to accommodate Owen to prevail. Owen castrated his lieutenants. Steele was unfairly lambasted by some critics as lacking the balls to back his. Like a marriage in which, for one, much sacrifice could be accommodated to keep the show on the road, the megalomaniac traits of the other were given fertile soil in which to grow. A navigator observing these two celestial bodies would have seen in one a lodestar, predictably guiding the helmsman, and the other a comet, burning brightly as it traversed the firmament before inevitably fizzling out in a cloud of cosmic dust. The columnist Alan Watkins once observed of David Steele, "He is the Margaret Thatcher of the Liberal Party." He goes on and on. Indeed, he led his party for a remarkable span of 12 years. His length of tenure, like his public opinion poll ratings, probably unmatched by any other 20th century leader. Owen was always too divisive to last. One was desperate for the merger to succeed, to open up British politics. The other would probably have been happy to see it collapse. I will not dwell on the depressing 4-year spectacle of two characters, locked in a pantomime horse, each pulling in a different direction. Their relationship was difficult, distant, and fractious. As an amanuensis, I have detailed notes of every meeting of the Joint Leaders Advisory Committee, and they do not make appetizing reading. The rise and fall of the alliance has been scientifically catalogued by Ivor Crewe and Anthony King, and tendentiously described by many others. What seems likely in retrospect is that Steele's haste for merger simply deepened Owen's intransigence. Roy Jenkins' aphorism that the difference between the two parties' policies was like that between Access and Barclaycard may have been a little exaggerated, but the elaboration of a draft manifesto for the 1987 general election should have been less vociferous than the drawing up of a manifesto to suit the competing wings of either of the major parties at that time. One must wonder whether the damaging dispute about the nuclear deterrent was not simply an artifice to allow Owen's SDP to keep its distance from the Liberals. After that, little could restore the earlier sheen to the alliance. Even the purchase of bright yellow ties for the leaders to wear on the morning of the 1987 manifesto launch, matching the garish cover of the document itself, could not brighten the prospects of a party whose promise had plummeted. As the two leaders' battle buses set off from the National Liberal Club in different directions to the glee of TV cameramen, our fate was sealed. We could see the car crash unfolding before our eyes. In discussing what should be done with the many unsold copies of the manifesto, one suggestion was to place one on every seat in the Albert Hall at the final election rally for the party faithful to wave in a sea of yellow. Yes, retorted Owen's assistant Maggie Smart. They could all shout, "Bye." The later careers are instructive. David Owen showed that no party could be small enough to give the total control he craved. David Steele retreated to Scotland to become the first presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament. One wonders whether their eyes ever met in latter years, as in latter years they paced the fraying carpets of oblivion in the cold corridors of the House of Lords. Thank you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Graham and Neil, for that terrific rendition of Graham's very interesting chat. We will come back, I think, in a minute to ask some questions about your presentation. But in the meantime, next we have Roger Carroll, who was Communications Director of the SDP and editor of the Social Democrat from the launch of the SDP until the end of 1983. He was also previously speechwriter for Prime Minister James Callaghan and has more than 25 years' experience as a communications consultant and speechwriter in the private sector. Roger, could I ask you to give us your insights now, please?
You can indeed. I'm going straight now, by the way. I think that focusing on an alleged feud between the Davids, with all respect, is both negative and I think a wild exaggeration. Compare the relationship to those of other pairs of people. Blair and Brown, for example, when Gordon Brown leaves no mobile phone unthrown. Heath and Thatcher. When I was in the press gallery, Heath actually asked some people in the press gallery, he said, I'd like to get rid of that bloody woman, but is there any other Tory woman good enough to be in the cabinet? I mean, how sexist can you get? Then Thatcher and Michael Heseltine were at daggers drawn. And even Churchill and Rab Butler, being very old, I remember Rab Butler, and he was saying that Churchill never warmed to him because he'd been an assistant to Churchill's appeasing predecessor. Rab Butler, sometimes in the war, would have to write down the speeches that Churchill was working out and dictating, walking up and down, especially in Chequers. For example, his most famous speech, "We will fight them on the beaches, we will fight them in the hills, we will never surrender." Butler wrote this down, and Churchill, according to Butler, would say, "We will fight them on the beaches. Would you fight them on the beaches, Rab? We will fight them in the hills. Would you fight them in the hills, Rab?" Meaning, I bloody well know you wouldn't, you appease. So by comparison, I think the relationship between the Davids was nothing like as bad as others. So let's put the whole thing in context, though. First of all, in terms of popular votes won in the 1983 and 87 general elections, the alliance was a stupendous success. In any democracy other than the UK, a party alliance that gained more than a quarter of the vote first time and almost a quarter second time would have had a huge number of seats in Parliament. The alliance won 23 and then 22 out of 650. Labour lost 3 million votes in 83 to them. The Conservatives lost 700,000 votes in 1983 while gaining an extra 58 seats. Also in that election and in the next one, the alliance won a large percentage of the vote in every region, whereas the Conservatives were strong in some and weak in others. Labour was strong in some and weak in others. The alliance was more of a national undertaking than either of the two old parties. Let's look at a few other things. External events can make a huge difference to election results. Had we lost the Falklands War, Mrs. Thatcher would have been much less popular, and had we not had huge revenues from the North Sea oil, our economy under the Tories would have been in a very poor state, and many more voters would have rebelled. I think in general, the alliance was a huge success in terms of the number of people who voted for it, in the way it could unite the country in a way that Tories and Labour couldn't. And the fact that we only got a handful of seats is because Britain, let's be honest, is a semi-democracy compared to New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Germany, Scandinavia. We're only semi-democratic. And it's a pity. Now, not only are we bad with a voting system, we're centralized in a way that other democracies are not. I think the real split was not between the Davids, but between David Owen and Roy Jenkins. That was a real feud. Roy, as you may know, had initially, when he was leaving Europe, where he was very successful, I think, wanted to join the Liberals. David Steele and others persuaded him to join the Gang of Three, as they were: Shirley Williams, David Owen, and Bill Rogers, who was sometimes unkindly called the other one. So the Gang of Three became the Gang of Four. But Roy was always interested in being very similar to, in terms of values and policies, to the Liberals, whereas David Owen was much more interested in recreating a moderate version of the Labour Party to overtake the left-wing party that Michael Foot was now in charge of. That was the real difference. David Owen wanted a moderate Labour Party like the German SDP or even Tony Blair's New Labour ahead of its time. Roy was more interested in liberal values. So that, I think, was the big split. Yes, things got a bit difficult from 83 to 87, but I don't recall David Owen slagging off Steele or speaking badly of him in private. They did disagree, as you'd expect, on a number of issues, and it was unfortunate that Shirley Williams and Bill Rogers lost their seats in 83 because their calming influence on Owen versus Jenkins and Steele vanished. David Owen saw himself, being former Foreign Secretary, as much more of a heavyweight than David Steele, and David Steele saw himself as leader of what had become a much bigger party in the Commons than the SDP. Then, as Graham was saying, in the run-up to 83, Steele and the Liberals acknowledged that Jenkins was the alliance Prime Minister designate, and they saw no reason to give Owen the same recognition. He was cross about that, but I don't think he had any great reason to be. He also hated, probably more than David Steele did, the spitting image puppets. They did nothing to improve relations. I think, therefore, it would be a mistake to characterize relations between the Davids as primarily conflictual. They go on far better than many other people. They cooperated sufficiently well to win roughly a quarter of the vote again in 87. They focused on local as well as national issues, whereas Labour and Tories had, as ever, an over-centralised focus. Both the Liberal and the SDP parties, I think, were creative in devising policies, and they pushed Labour away from its hard left position into something a bit more moderate. Their inability to break through the two-party system was, as I say, primarily due to external factors, especially our barely democratic electoral system. But given the very low esteem in which Britain's politicians and their political system are now held, an eventual Lib Dem breakthrough is by no means out of the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. That was fascinating, especially the sort of interplay of the relationships between the Gang of Four and David Steele. So we'll be coming on to question and answer session shortly, but first of all, I think, Duncan, you have a few words you'd like to say. And I should just point out, Graham has managed to get himself online by phoning me. So I will be myself and the voice of Sir Graham Watson when we come back after Duncan has spoken.
Thanks very much, Christine. Can you hear me okay? Yes,
Yep.
good. Just checking. We've had a few audio problems. So my name is Duncan Brack. I'm editor of the Journal of Liberal History. And I just wanted to say a few words about the Liberal Democrat History Group, which is hosting this meeting. I guess many of you will know us, but not everyone. So we were set up when this party was founded back in 1988 to promote research and discussion of the history of the Liberal Democrats and our predecessor parties, the Liberal Party and the SDP. Because, of course, as we were just talking about, the SDP was only founded in 1981, but the Liberal Party has a much longer history, going back perhaps 300 years. So we do this in a number of ways. We publish the Journal of Liberal History, so that's the summer issue, leading with a piece on Tony Greaves, much missed Lib Dem peer and stalwart. And that's a quarterly. The autumn issue should be hitting subscribers' doorsteps just about now. And if you want to buy a single issue, you can do that on our website. We're leading with a major piece on Shirley Williams, who also sadly died this year. The second thing we do is organise meetings like this one. We'll have a meeting in, our next meeting will be in, well, probably online in January or February still, depending on the COVID situation. If it's not online, it would be in probably in the National Liberal Club in London. We're still sorting out the topic. And then we'll have another fringe at the spring conference. We publish a range of books and booklets about aspects of liberal history. And if you're new to this topic, we publish a, excuse me, a concise booklet called Liberal History, everything you wanted to know about the history of the party and its predecessors in just 32 pages. So that's quite a good place to start. And for those of you who are more familiar, there are longer reference books and books like the Dictionary of Liberal Quotations, British Liberal Leaders, and things like that. And we maintain a website at liberalhistory.org.uk. We're here in the exhibition, so if you'd like to come and chat to us about anything that you're interested in, find out more about what the group's doing, then please do visit us during the hours when the exhibition stand is open. You can take a subscription out on our website or order any of our books or publications. The annual sub for 4 issues is £25 a year, but if you subscribe now at this conference, we'll give you the autumn issue, which is the last issue of the old sub, and then you get another 4. So you're getting basically an extra one. And the last thing I wanted to say was, if you look at the polls tab on the right, we are using the poll here to ask you, to invite you to sign up to our mailing list. So we've asked the question, I agreed to join the History Group email mailing list and share my email only with the History Group. We won't share it with anyone else, for news of our meetings and publications and any other meetings and publications we think you might be interested in. So if you vote yes to that, we'll be sent your email address after the conference, and we'll just add you to our email address. Email mailing list. So thank you very much, everyone. Christine, back to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask here. I'm just about to answer what I think is Graham on the phone. There we are. That's us now. Thank you very much for joining us. Can you hear everything quite clearly, Graham? Now, if Graham were to speak, can everybody else hear Graham?
Hello, this is me.
Yes.
There we go. Now, Neil, I believe you were looking for some, you were curating the questions. I have one before we start, though. I don't get to see this often, too young to remember or to actually ever have met David Owen, but I have met David Steele, obviously, on so many occasions. And I know the respect with which he has held in the party nowadays. I wonder if there doesn't seem to be the same nostalgia surrounding David Owen. Now, that I might be completely wrong in that, but do you think there is a difference between the way they are both held in regard, or they're both regarded nowadays by younger members of the party? Roger, I'll ask you first.
It's partly personalities, I think. David Steele has a very likable personality. David Owen has a sort of admirable personality, but it doesn't get on with everybody. And he wasn't party leader for that long. He was 83 to 87, 88, and then it all disappeared, whereas David Steele's had a much longer run and people have become much more familiar with him. Also, one of the really good things that the Liberals have contributed towards the Liberal Democrats, and which sometimes the Conservatives seem to be copying a little bit in the North now, is a great focus on local people and local events and local decision making. And David Steele was very good at that. So right across the country, people would have come across him and worked with him.
It's interesting. Graham, did you want to add anything to that?
Thank you, Christine. Can I just say how great it is to share a platform with Roger Carroll? Roger played a major role and a senior role in the alliance at the time. I was simply a 26-year-old bag carrier to David Steele. You know, we have a different perspective. I don't share Roger's view that the alliance was a great success. I don't think one can see it in those terms, although it undoubtedly brought some people into our fold. But I do very much agree with him that the relations between David Owen and David Steele were actually not bad at all. I mean, there was a professional working relationship there. There was a certain respect between the two, although they were certainly not natural partners. I think if you want to look for really vociferous relations, they're the relations between David Owen and Shirley Williams, Roy Jenkins, and Bill Rogers. Those were the really difficult relations towards the 1987 election. How do young people see this? Well, some went with David Owen into the continuing SDP and may well still be followers. But I agree with Roger. I mean, the David Owen period was too short for many of the young people in today's Liberal Democrats to have any real memories.
I would.
And you don't look old enough, Christine, either.
I will never rebuff flattery. Thank you, David. Graham. On that point, though, just to move on, Neil Stockley was asking what you thought the philosophical differences between the two Davids might have been. For example, was David Steele a social democrat in any way? Maybe David Owen, was he a maverick Thatcherite?
Gosh, I don't think he was a maverick Thatcherite. I think he was basically a social democrat. He liked the Labour Party as it was before it was taken over for a while by the left. And David Steele was a classical liberal, I think. So they're not too far apart. And all across Europe and elsewhere, you see people from these different approaches forming coalitions, but then they've got the sort of system that gives you the number of seats that you vote for, whereas we don't do that. You can get 35% of the vote if you're Tory or Labour in the right circumstances and have an overall majority. You can have 25% of the vote, like the Libs and the Social Democrats, and have hardly any seats. And it's not just the Lib Dems who've had this problem. If you look at the 2015 election, Farage's lot got about 14% and one seat. Add the Lib Dems and Farage and the Greens together, and you had 25% of the vote and 10 seats out of 650 between them. We do not have a really good electoral system at all, do we?
We don't, although I have to say the concept of a coalition with the Greens and Nigel Farage doesn't fill me with any great joy. Graham, what about you? What do you think about that? Was David Steele really a social democrat and Owen a maverick Thatcherite?
Well, the joke was Steele was the ideal social democrat and Jenkins was the ideal liberal. And I think, there was a good laugh to be had there. Perhaps even a grain of truth in it. No, I wouldn't have described David Owen as a Thatcherite. I think Roger is right. However, there was one difference, and I think it became an increasingly important difference between David Owen on the one hand and Steele and Shirley Williams and Bill Rogers and so on the other. And that was that David Owen was a convinced Atlanticist. Not only did he have an American wife, he spent his summers on the other side of the Atlantic. He always looked that way. Roy Jenkins, David Steele, Shirley and others looked across the channel and they saw the UK's future in the European Union. I think that was an increasingly important difference.
Well, now that actually leads us into a question we have, leads us in quite nicely to a question we have from the chat, which was, how do you explain David Owen's conversion to Brexit? Or you may just have explained it, Graham. But Roger, what would you say? Why do you think he was a Brexiteer, shall we say?
I don't know. I was so horrified. I didn't I didn't read up what his arguments were. I thought there's enough silly arguments in favour of Brexit. My goodness.
Graham, did you have any thoughts on that?
I simply thought that this is what happens to a meteor traversing the firmament. You know, as it comes to the end of its life, it explodes in different directions.
Okay, well, if you have any questions that you would like to ask about that period in the party's history, or a reflection on it, or the relationship between the two Davids, or for that matter, the rest of the gang of four, just pop them in the question and answer, and we'll ask them. In the meantime, I'll go to a question from Jack Worrell, who is asking, if it wasn't for the Liberal Assembly's decision, slightly off topic, but it's all right, we'll allow it. If it wasn't for the Liberal Assembly's decision on the replacement of Polaris, do you think that we would have made the breakthrough we hoped for in 1987? Graham, I'll come to you first on that one.
Well, I think there is no doubt that that was a very damaging moment. And it was damaging in two senses. I mean, the first is that it gave the impression that David Steele had no control over his party, so it cut the ground under Steele's feet, if you like. And the second is it was red rag to a bull to David Owen. When I spoke in my introduction about what seemed to be the tendency to pugnacity of Liberals at the time, uncharacteristic perhaps, it was deeply damaging to the alliance. You know, I think when one looks at the period, you can find things on both sides that caused the project to fail. And that was certainly part of it. And I recall the very bitter relations within the Parliamentary Liberal Party against Paddy for what he did at the time.
That's interesting. That's something I think that perhaps most of us are not aware of. Roger, what about yourself? What do you think? Do you think that decision was crucial?
Yes, and I think that both Tory and Labour politicians, or those who came from one or the other of those, like David Owen, were far too, and still are, far too craven towards the United States. And they like to pretend, if we go along and say, yes, sir, 3 bags full, that makes us a great world power. And I think it's a great pity. I would have thought that David Steele's position was at least as sensible as David Owen. One could argue that it would have been better to have put forward an argument for nuclear disarmament if everybody would do it, rather than unilateral nuclear disarmament. But it is interesting that Owen, followed by people like Tony Blair on the Labour side, have always been far too keen on just sucking up to the Americans. Tories as well are just like that.
How do you think they might have seen the announcement this week of the new Pacific deal with Australia and the military deal with Australia and America? I think David Owen would have been in favour of that.
He might likely to have been in favour, but it's hard to see it as very sensible, given that we're in Europe and we've got the Russians at the other end of Europe, and we spend time sending massive warships, including aircraft carriers with no British aircraft on, out east to make futile gestures. Are we really going to go to war with China? Of course we're not.
No, not at all.
Well,
Yeah.
I see it, Christine, as a kind of, it's a direct response, or it's a direct impact of Brexit. it could never have happened without Brexit. The United States is desperate to haul the UK back into cooperation, recognizing it's going to be in the military field. But I think it's worth recalling that at the time, David Steele and some within the SDP worked very hard to try to get agreement on support for the nuclear freeze proposal, which came up in the 1980s. I mean, this was a terribly fraught time. Gorbachev and Reagan finally met in Reykjavik in 1986 and tried to sort it out, and it led to some limitation of nuclear weapons. But Europe was going to be the theatre in which nuclear war was played out. There was a serious proposal for a nuclear freeze. It might have provided a shield within the 1987 general election manifesto that we could have paraded behind.
Possibly. Just moving on slightly, should the alliance have merged earlier, say 1984, is one question from the chat, to have one leader in 1987, would that have made a difference? Graham, I'll come to you first.
Well, I'm sure it would, but neither party would have accepted the other's leader, I think, is probably the case.
Roger, what do you think?
I think it would have been too soon. They did quite well, as I think, in the 83 election with a quarter of the vote. They could have thought, well, maybe we'll get rather more of the Labour vote now, and people will get ultimately fed up with Margaret Thatcher, which her own party did a few years later. So who knows?
Well, if the merger probably wouldn't have made that much of a difference, do you think it might have made a difference, or what might have happened if another member of the Gang of Four, say Shirley or Roy, had replaced Owen? Interestingly, a whole lot of people tried to get Shirley to run for the leadership in the first election, and I think she made a mistake in not. She underrated herself. A little bit too much modesty is quite a rare thing in politicians, but when it happens, Alan Johnson, I think you could argue, is in the same position with Labour. He underestimated himself. And Shirley would have been probably a more unifying leader. And she was certainly very popular in the opinion polls. It's a shame she underplayed herself very much. What do you think, Graham?
No, I agree absolutely with what Roger says, and I've nothing really to add. Shirley would have been an ideal candidate. The relationship with Steele would have been better, and I think they would have agreed quite easily a common manifesto, and they would have agreed to joint selection. This will sound a rather strange concept, but to those who were around, there was a big question, huge argument about whether we should jointly select candidates for Parliament. David Owen wanted a situation where, in seats which were allocated to the SDP members should choose the candidate and the Liberals should have no say. And he was happy to live with vice versa in the Liberal seats. What David Steele wanted was the candidate to be chosen jointly from a short list of candidates for the party to whom the seat had been allocated. And I think that would have been tremendously helpful in unifying the party and bringing it towards a merger.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to look at it in a sort of modern perspective, and if we had been merging with anybody and looking at it through the prism, if you like, of 2019, the thought of giving up a seat to the other half without having any say in who the candidate was doesn't give the activists any ownership of the campaign. You cut them out immediately. So I'm thinking it might have been difficult to get people in the the Liberals to go out and deliver leaflets for a candidate that they'd had that came from essentially a different party to them, and they'd had no say in. So that's quite a thought.
Well, in practical terms, you could have found that the Liberal activists might have gone to the next constituency, and Labour activists, Social Democrat activists might have swapped the other way around.
They may well have done.
They would have been involved, but not necessarily in their own constituency.
Yeah. Graham, what were you going to say?
I was saying, interestingly, Christine, there was one exception to this, and it was in the north of Scotland. Because in Ross, Cromarty and Skye, the two parties agreed, by mutual agreement, to have everybody involved in the selection. And Charles Kennedy was the person selected. And that was one of the reasons why Charles, I think, made such a good and obvious next leader of the alliance. Yes,
yeah. He was unique in a lot of ways, though, wasn't he? So that's something else. Now, to turn to a lighter subject for a moment, ever so light. I think you touched on this in your presentation, Graham. But do we think really that the spitting image was all that damaging, or was it just a joke that afterwards, with hindsight, people said, well, that was damaging, rather than look at the actual situation? Did we lack a sense of humour?
I suspect it was less damaging in the eye of the public than it was in what it did to Liberal activists. It really got their goat, if I might say that. Liberal activists reacted infuriatedly towards the spitting image puppet, and it contributed to bad feeling within the alliance. Yes,
so potentially the internal damage that it did was greater than the external damage. Would you agree with that, Roger?
Oh, David Owen absolutely hated the spitting image. It drove him nuts. He was probably even more angry than some of the Liberal activists. And he thought he would get blamed, that he was sort of talking like this, and he wasn't.
So do you think it's a period of the party's history that we give sufficient attention, that we look at it enough, or do we assume that modern members of the party know about it and perhaps we should be making more of an effort? What do you think? I know Duncan might say yes. What do you think?
I think we should look at what lessons can be learnt from any of our periods, and in the context of we've had democracy of some sort for a couple of hundred years, and in Britain, and in that time there's been only one new party that's emerged in a big way, and that was Labour 100 years ago. So breaking through can be quite difficult, and the more we can learn from what to do and what not to do from our past experience, the better.
Yes, I think actually we recognised that in 2019 with Change, who were going to change politics, and they didn't. Graham, would you agree with that?
I would agree with Roger, but I suspect that in the hugely fertile mind of Duncan Bragg, our leader in this session, there was the thought that perhaps something like this might happen again. One cannot exclude the possibility of large numbers of blue wall Tories deciding they've had enough. It looks slightly less likely on the Labour side, but who knows?
Who knows? Yeah.
We might well be in a situation forced by our electoral system where a breakaway from another party would have a chance of changing the game in British politics if it allied with us. And perhaps for that reason, it's a good idea to look back at what our experience was and how we would do it differently.
Certainly, like you, I think it's hypothetically at least not beyond the bounds of possibility that in certain circumstances they could. But certainly during 2018-19, there was a lot of disquiet in the Labour Party. And there you potentially had an almost exact parallel. So we should perhaps have been looking at the lessons then. But just to move back to the individuals again, one question we've had in the chat was, do you think, and I'll come to Roger first on this one, you'll see why in a moment, David Owen saw himself as an intellectual with great rigour and thought maybe the Liberals were not quite serious?
I don't think so. I think he just disagreed with them on some issues and agreed on quite a lot of issues as well. It was an odd period for people who'd been Labour, because quite a lot of people who did quite well in the Labour Party later, I won't mention any names, but they very nearly came over with the Gang of Four. It was very uncertain, and some of those who didn't come over thought they should have. It was a very odd period.
Yeah, Graham, would you agree with that? What do you think?
Yes, and I would add something. I think something that needs to be remembered is that David Steele in 1983 had already been leader of the party for 7 years. There are not many folks survive that long,
No.
let alone the 11 or 12 years that he served. He was not full of energy. David Owen, by contrast, had just become leader of his party, had bags of energy, and, you know, was forever leaving his office to stand by the ticker tape machine, which we had in those days, to see what the Press Association was reporting and to rush out a statement immediately. I think that, you know, that contributed to the relationship and to people's perceptions of it.
A ticker tape machine. There's a thought. Would that, you think, explain his attitude to the Liberals, this being full of energy and the new leader, and David maybe being a bit more relaxed and in his place? Do you think that was at the root of his attitude to us? Sorry, the Liberals? Big mistake there.
Who knows what? Well, Roger is probably better placed to describe David Owen's attitude towards the Liberals. I personally never felt that he despised the Liberal Party in any way, but I think he felt that it was not his type of party.
Yeah. Yes, he was basically a social democrat, more like a sort of German social democrat. He also greatly regretted that he was only foreign secretary for about 10 minutes, in a sense. Things were looking really good, and then it all sort of fell apart for him. And he thought that maybe things will happen again if he got the leadership, and he lost to Roy Jenkins, who then changed the nature of the party that from what Owen would have made it. So I think Owen had a few near misses, he would think, and foreign secretary for 10 minutes being one of them.
Do you think that maybe characterised his career, that he could have been, and I don't mean this in any disparaging way, because he was undoubtedly one of the huge figures of that period of British political history, but do you think there was a feeling that he could have been even more if circumstances had been right and perhaps the dice had fallen a wee bit differently?
I think he would have hoped to have been the leader of the Labour Party if things had gone a little bit differently, and Prime Minister, and then he will have thought that he almost beat Roy Jenkins for the leadership. And it was interesting that the people who voted for David Owen against Jenkins were largely the party activists, and the people who voted for Roy were largely folk who liked the idea but didn't get out much to knock on doors or try and construct policy very much.
What about you, Graham? What do you feel about that?
Well, no, I'm not sure I would share Roger's view on that, because I can think of many Jenkinsites who were hugely active in by-elections and general elections and so on. I mean, but you know, I think that Owen certainly had ambitions beyond what was perhaps realizable within the scope of the alliance. It was too small for him. He saw himself as a big player. And it was not that others did not, but they saw the breakthrough in a different way.
That's interesting. In what way do you think they saw it?
Well, I think that Shirley and David and Roy saw the possibility for the alliance to make a breakthrough and become a substantial force, maybe 150, 200 seats in Parliament, and thereby to change the shape of British politics. I'm not sure any of them really believed that they were going to sweep into office with a majority of a couple of hundred seats. For David Owen, it wouldn't have been enough.
That's interesting. That's interesting. One question has mentioned that the key attitude might have been the respective attitudes to the parties and to negotiations. Was David Owen a tough negotiator? But once agreement was reached, he kept it, whereas David Steele was a wee bit more of a renegade? I've never thought of him that way, but I could be completely wrong. I'm thinking about the David Steele now. He may have been very different then. Graham?
Well, Owen was not so much a tough negotiator. He was the only negotiator. He would not allow anyone else in the SDP to negotiate for him. David Steele was quite happy to allow the two-party presidents to talk to each other, the two-party chairmen to talk to each other, the environment spokespersons to talk to each other, and so on, and come up with it. And in fact, one of David's weaknesses is he didn't really want to get involved in the details a lot of the time. David Owen wanted to be in charge of every dot and comma of every press release ever issued. I hope
I can't see anything about that.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Duncan has asked me to remind everybody that there is a special issue of the Journal of Liberal History on the legacy of the Alliance back in 1998. And like all other issues, it's free to download. So there's a link in the chat if you want to download that from 1998. We have a few minutes left, gentlemen, but if you would both like to just sum up. Roger, if you would like to go first, if there are any closing remarks you'd like to make.
Yes, one point I'd like to make first is that we were over 50% in the opinion polls for quite some time before the 83 election. A few things to change that around, including, I guess, Falklands War changed things. But it was a near miss. And I think the fact that it was a near miss means that we should keep trying in this sort of thing, because it'll happen. People, I don't think, are madly in love with Keir Starmer's Labour Party now, or with Boris Johnson particularly. So, whereas the Liberal Democrats have got quite a lot of sensible policies. So, if we keep at it, you never know, things can change.
Everything can change. Graham, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree, and I think that a party which came down very rapidly in the 2015 general election can equally bounce back very rapidly. Yeah. I think looking back at the 83 to 87 period, there is a silver lining to the cloud, and that is that Tony Blair and the Labour Party was a very different animal than would otherwise have been the case. And Blair, pre-Iraq, did a lot of things of which we thoroughly approved. Indeed, had he not enjoyed a majority, we would probably almost certainly have been in coalition with him. So, you know, it had an impact. Thinking about for the future, yes, if we want to make a breakthrough, again, we have to attract folk from the other parties. So the question is, around which issues are we going to do it? And how are we going to make sure that this time we prevail?
Okay, well,
and we should bear in mind that very often when the Liberals and then Liberal Democrats have zoomed forward, it's been partly through focusing on local issues and doing very well in individual constituencies or individual regions, and it builds from there. So we should keep in mind that it's good to be a local party as well as a national party.
Well, thank you both very much. I have found this evening hugely enlightening and enjoyable. And I think, and I hope Duncan would agree with me in this, you can never know too much about the party's history or its past, because we do learn from it. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we could perhaps have learned without wishing, it's not a pejorative comment, but maybe there were things that would have been useful in 2019 if we had looked at them a wee bit more closely or from a different perspective. And I think, you know, it's always interesting, and I do like Graham's suggestion that perhaps we might find ourselves in that situation. I hope it doesn't take too long, but that we might find ourselves in that situation one day soon. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking part. And Duncan, would you like to say something before we go?
Gosh, I'm not sure there's much I need to say to add, but just come and, if you're interested in subscribing to the journal or knowing more about our work, or would like to help us indeed in our activities, then do come visit us at the exhibition, have a look at our website, and perhaps download some of our older issues of the journal. I said the most recent 10 issues are only to subscribers, but the older ones are all free. And thank you to Christine, and thank you to Roger and Graham, and I'm really glad Graham was able to overcome his technical difficulties.
It's amazing what you can do. I'm told that NASA could get Apollo 13 back with sellotape. Well, I think we've outdone them tonight. Thank you very much.
Great fun.
Bye.
All the best.
Bye.